I know many of you here, but my name is David Izraelowitz, and I'm the current chair of the J. Robert Oppenheimer Memorial Committee. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture. I also want to recognize the Los Alamos Jewish Center as a co-sponsor of this event. As you can read from the title, this is sure to be a very informative and maybe even provocative talk about the points of intersection between Louis Strauss and J. Robert Oppenheimer. I wrote this before I was here, but I said, I'm pleased by the large attendance. I think that's another underestimate. And I did say, I had no idea there were so many fans of Louis Strauss in Los Alamos. So our speaker, Jack Shlachter, is a physicist who worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory for over 30 years, with briefer stints at Brookhaven National Laboratory in New York, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, the latter two based in Vienna, Austria. He led both the physics division and the theoretical division during his Lanyard career, although I believe not simultaneously.
That's correct.
However, in parallel, Jack is an ordained rabbi who led the Jewish congregation in Los Alamos for many years, was the rabbi in Center Moriches, New York, during his years at Brookhaven, and now serves as rabbi of Hamakom, a congregation in Santa Fe, as well as the Los Alamos Jewish Center. And he's also provided itinerant rabbinic support to far-flung Jewish communities, including those in Vienna and in Beijing. So please join me in welcoming Rabbi and Dr. Jack Shlachter.
Thank you very much, David. I want to thank the J. Robert Oppenheimer Memorial Committee, and I want to thank Beverly Post, my wife, and the Los Alamos Jewish Center for sponsoring this talk. I want to start with a safety and security message. I want to point out where the emergency exit is, but for this purpose, it's actually for my benefit, not for yours, because I have a suspicion that there's going to be a little tension between the speaker and the audience for this talk, and I want to make sure I know how to get out. So let me be very clear with some caveats up front. I am not a historian. I'm not even an amateur historian, though I had a lot of fun doing some research for this talk. And the views that I present in this talk are my own views. They don't represent any organization. And let me just say that as I was going around town over the last few weeks and people would say, I hear that you're giving this talk, many people said, I know something about Louis Strauss and Oppenheimer, and they would continue in that conversation by telling me things I didn't know. So I'm a little intimidated that this is a very knowledgeable crowd, and probably you know more about this topic than I do. But the perspective that I want to share tonight is a Jewish perspective, and I thought I might bring a little bit of insight on that relationship to you in a way that you may not have appreciated previously. So if I started with a show of hands and we made this a competition between Oppenheimer and Strauss, I think it would be pretty overwhelming. This is Los Alamos, New Mexico, after all. My hope is that I shift the conversation slightly to make it a little more balanced, and that's how I came up with this title. So here's an outline of the talk. I'm going to introduce the characters, and I'll give you a few of their traits and summarize the story of their conflict, if you will. But then I have to digress because the dimension that I'm going to be looking at is their Jewish connection. So I need to put everybody on the same page, and so I'm going to describe Judaism in general, and in particular Judaism in this country, in the United States. And then I'm going to seemingly converge to one building. It's a building in New York City called Temple Emmanuel, and surprisingly, that building plays a role in this story. I'll tell you a little bit about the connection that both Strauss and Oppenheimer had to Judaism as I understand it. I'll share some of the highlights and some of the lowlights for both men. And then at the end, I'm going to share with you a historical document that informed my thinking on what I call a tragedy. And it's a tragedy for both characters, not just for Oppenheimer. So here are the protagonists in our story. Of course, you see J. Robert Oppenheimer and, I think I have the wrong slide here. Tomorrow night, I'm speaking about Maimonides as part of Faith and Science series. The individual you see on the right is Moses Maimonides. He was a rabbi in the 12th century, and he doesn't have anything to do with this story, except for the fact that he was a scientist in his day as well as a rabbi, and that he faced some very serious anti-Semitism, which is going to play a role in this story as well. They didn't call it anti-Semitism back then, but he had to escape with his family and for about 10 years wander around till he found a home that was more amenable to Judaism, and that's going to play a role in this story. So here are the protagonists in the story. Wait, no, that's not right either. That's Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss was a Maimonides scholar in the 20th century, when I looked up L. Strauss, he's the first one who came up, so that's not who I want. Here's who I want. That's L. Strauss. No, that's Levi Strauss. Sorry. That's Levi Strauss, who brought us Levi's, and out of respect for this wonderful, wonderful turnout tonight, I am not wearing my traditional Levi's, but most of the time I am, and so I'm really appreciative to him. So let's get to our real protagonists. So here we have J. Robert Oppenheimer and Louis Strauss. He was from the South. He grew up in Virginia, and he always wanted to have the name pronounced Strauss, even though it's spelled the same as Leo Strauss and Levi Strauss, S-T-R-A-U-S-S. So I have deliberately placed them on the screen where they are, with Oppenheimer on the left and Strauss on the right. That's a political statement, as well as I had to put them somewhere. So I'm guessing everybody knows this, but hopefully nobody's going to get lost in this talk. So let me just say, Oppenheimer was a brilliant physicist. He served as the scientific leader of the Manhattan Project to develop the first atomic bombs. He headed the effort here at Los Alamos between 1943 and 45. He was instrumental in the selection of the site. We are here today because of Oppenheimer. And after the war, he became the leading scientific spokesman for atomic issues. Strauss may not be so familiar to you, so just in a nutshell, he was a businessman and a political appointee. He was appointed to be a member of the Atomic Energy Commission after the war, and then he was the chair of the Atomic Energy Commission between 1953 and 1958. And he was a key player in the effort to strip Oppenheimer of his security clearance in 1954. There was a 2-hour panel discussion at the laboratory quite recently. Was anybody at that presentation at the lab? So I was there. It was a wonderful presentation. It included the laboratory director, Tom Mason. It included Kai Bird, the co-author of American Prometheus, Anna Lobey from the JROMC, and Tim Reeser, who is a Senate staffer who played a huge role in vacating the decision to remove the clearance from Oppenheimer. Alan Carr, the lab's historian, served as the moderator for that 2-hour discussion, and I paid close attention, and in the 2 hours that I was there, the word Jewish or Jew was never mentioned at all. So yes, there are many important factors at work that led to this tension between the two individuals. I'm trying to expose one of those factors. I'm not trying to argue it was the most important one, but I think it was an important dimension to the relationship between Strauss and Oppenheimer. They had a strained relationship. I think Judaism was one aspect of that. They also had numerous interactions, not just because of the clearance hearing, but Strauss was I think, the chair of the board for the institute at Princeton, and Oppenheimer became the director there. So they had interactions that went beyond the AEC. Both of these individuals, I'm going to have to touch on each of them separately and come back and forth a little bit to make this story make sense. But I will tell you that it's J. Robert Oppenheimer, and to the best that we understand, the J stands for Julius. That's what his birth certificate says. That was his father's name as well. Louis Strauss was named Louis, and his father was Louis also. Now, that may not strike you as particularly odd, but for those of us who grew up with Jewish traditions, that is very unusual for Jews from what we call the Ashkenazic part of the world, the Germany and East European part of the world. People were not named, and to this day are not named after a living relative. So this is already a little bit odd from a Jewish perspective, that it's Julius Oppenheimer and Louis Strauss, and that was the names of their fathers as well. Strauss's grandparents came to the United States in the 1830s and 1840s. Actually, I think that's 3 of his 4 grandparents. Oppenheimer's father came to the United States from Germany as a teen in 1888. So there's this German emigration aspect to their upbringing. They both had a passion for physics. You may not have known that about Strauss. Strauss actually, you'll see that a little later, Strauss cared very deeply about physics when he was young, but because his family was strapped for money, he never was able to go to college. So he didn't pursue his physics as a professional. Oppenheimer, on the other hand, grew up with wealth. Strauss's family had wealth, but they lost that in a recession between 1913 and 1914. So I can't resist showing this because this is how I got into history in general. The Manhattan Project is littered with Jewish names, and I really mean everywhere you look there is a Jewish individual. And I tried to group these a little bit. Lise Meitner was one of the ones who figured out what had happened in the Hans Strassmann experiment, that fission had occurred. That led to Einstein writing the letter that was really composed and driven by Leo Szilard, and Wigner served as the one who transported Szilard out to Einstein's summer home out on Long Island. Teller also was along for the ride on at least one of those visits because the letter iterated many times. Peierls and Frisch had a parallel effort to write a letter in England that led to the development of the Manhattan Project. They then came to Los Alamos as part of the British contingent. And then I list a whole bunch of people who are associated with theoretical division. That was what I first noticed when I joined theoretical division, that pretty much anybody who had a leadership role was Jewish. That's that list on the bottom starting with Oppenheimer, and then the list starting at the top there with Glauber, who was a subsequent Nobel Prize winner. When he came to the lab, he was only 18, but he was actually recruited to work on the Manhattan Project at the age of 18. And you recognize other names there, Feynman as well. Then the next group of people, Bloch left the laboratory. He was only at Los Alamos for a few months and then decided this is not the project he wanted to invest his energy in, so he left. And the rest of them, I believe, well, the next batch are experimentalists, and then we have some more theorists. Ulam, because he wasn't in T Division in 1945, he had been sent off to work with Teller in a separate organization. Rotblat, a subsequent Nobel Prize winner for the Peace Nobel Prize, who left the laboratory as well, and Robbie, who was a consultant. But every one of these people was Jewish, or certainly had a strong Jewish connection. Let's come back to our main characters. And I wanted to look at them in their early ages with their own writing. So I captured a poem from each of them. The one from Oppenheimer was written when he was 19 years old. The one from Strauss when he was 23 years old. And I think when you read these poems, you get a sense of what their character was like when they were younger. And in particular, I'll just share a few little phrases here, from the Oppenheimer poem, and the slow light betrays us and our wistfulness. It has this sort of, what would you call it, ethereal sense to it, if you will. This poem by Strauss, on the other hand, gives a little indication of his personality, aggressive and vindictive. The blood of Maccabees, this is associated with the holiday of Hanukkah on the Jewish calendar. The blood of Maccabees runs in my veins, calling me to rise and smite the foes of God and righteousness. This is at the age of 23, but I think some elements of his personality are already showing through here. So I don't think that Oppenheimer and Strauss were polar opposites. They could both be mean and vindictive. This is a quote from Hans Bethe, the physicist, who was, of course, no fool. He was the head of theoretical division during the war. Hans Bethe said, "Oppenheimer could make people feel they were fools." And of course, if you know the story that led up to the clearance investigation for Oppenheimer, Oppenheimer had insulted Strauss on one too many occasions. And he had done that, in fact, in front of a public Senate hearing. He ridiculed Strauss. And so he made Strauss feel like a fool. And here you have Strauss, who's filled with vindictiveness and aggressiveness at the age of 23. And believe me, it didn't go away. So it's unfortunate in my mind that this clash occurred. Here's a poem that I think would have been a little more balanced if we could have gotten them to read this poem in their youth, because it talks about two divided streams, and they're going in different directions, but by each the truth is spread, the law unfurled, and both embrace the world. So where did this poem come from? Another Jewish individual, that is Emma Lazarus, whose poem that you probably know about, "Give me your tired, your poor," sits at the base of the Statue of Liberty. But Emma Lazarus wrote that poem, and I thought that poem is actually, that was a segment from a poem called The New Year, Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, 5643, which if you work it out was 1883 on the secular calendar. She wrote that poem about two divided streams. I couldn't resist when I got on a roll about poetry, so just indulge me for a moment. There's ChatGPT. I posed a question to ChatGPT. What can you tell me about the relationship between Oppenheimer and Strauss? This is an online AI tool, and I'm not going to read this to you, but its virtue is that it took 2 seconds. I couldn't have written that in 2 seconds. I don't think it's great poetry, but it does say, "Two figures stood with minds that shone, their paths entwined, their stories unfold," etc. So I just wanted to say that they did have this conflict. It's even known by ChatGPT. So let's turn to look at Oppenheimer for a moment. There's the iconic image of his hat. You know that's Oppenheimer the minute you see the hat. I think the JROMC uses that as a symbol at times. It's very iconic. And what is that hat? It's a pork pie hat. For goodness sakes, if you're Jewish, would you have a pork pie hat? I mean, to me, that's already problematic. And I think, all joking aside, it's actually quite true that Oppenheimer's relationship to his Judaism was at best conflicted. He had lifelong ambivalence about his Jewish identity. His parents felt themselves to be German immigrants striving to be American. His father, I said, came over as a teen from Germany. His mother, Ella, was born in the United States, but her family had emigrated from Germany as well. The family was ethnically and culturally Jewish, but they belonged to no synagogue, and Judaism appeared to have played no role in the Oppenheimer household. Ella, in particular, did not care for or want to be associated with Julius's first-generation American Jewish colleagues. She really wanted to distance herself from those Jewish colleagues of JRO's father. And so JRO grew up acquiring what I have read is called a certain conceit, and he was uneasy about his Jewishness, trying to hide it throughout his life. This is a quote from a mathematician I don't know. Somebody here may know who this is, Mildred Goldberger. She labeled Oppie, and I'm quoting, a self-hating Jew who had to marry an anti-Semite to prove to himself that he was right. That's a pretty problematic statement. But, you know, Kitty was not Jewish, and I think that was probably important for Oppenheimer. And then I'll close this slide with another quote from I. Rabi, a Nobel Prize winner from 1944. Rabi said, Oppenheimer was Jewish, but he wished he weren't. And I think that's really important for understanding that relationship between Oppenheimer and Strauss. So let's turn to Rabi just for a minute, because Rabi was close to Oppenheimer in many ways. He was a very strong proponent for Oppenheimer at the clearance hearing. An eminent physicist. He won the Nobel Prize in 1944, as I said. He was an immigrant. He came to the United States as a baby. He grew up on the Lower East Side. That's quite different from JRO's upbringing in a much more affluent area. But early on, he became an atheist, and I love this story that for his coming-of-age ceremony at age 13, and for his bar mitzvahs, he gave a Yiddish speech on how electric light works. That was his compromise with his parents. Now, he studied physics in Europe because that's where everybody had to study physics back then. But it was really Rabi, my understanding is Rabi played a seminal role in making the United States a place where people could actually go on to have successful physics careers without having to go to Europe to study. But you'll notice that it says he was the only Jewish faculty member then at Columbia. That's because there were restrictions. Being Jewish in the United States was not the best thing to be if you were trying to make progress. And he played a role in Los Alamos. As you know, he was a consultant. He didn't actually move to Los Alamos, but in 1942, Oppenheimer attempted to recruit both Robert Bacher and Rabi to work at Los Alamos on this secret project, and they convinced Oppenheimer that the idea that he had of making this a military laboratory was a bad idea. And it's really to Rabi's credit as well as Bacher's credit that people worked as civilian scientists, not as military scientists. Rabi knew Oppenheimer very well, and he really was a friend of his, but he was also critical of Oppenheimer's connection to his Judaism. Even though Rabi himself was an atheist, he did not reject or hide his Jewishness. Rabi said of Oppenheimer, Oppenheimer was overeducated in those fields which lie outside the scientific tradition, such as his interest in religion, but here he specifies in the Hindu religion in particular, which resulted in a feeling of mystery of the universe that surrounded Oppenheimer like a fog. He saw physics clearly if he was looking backwards at what had been done. But when he tried to look at things that were unknown, everything seemed sort of mystical and ethereal, like that poem that we looked at. And Rabi says that Oppenheimer turned away from the hard, crude methods of theoretical physics into a mystical realm of broad intuition. So that's part of what shaped Oppenheimer's character. Rabi, of course, never tried to suppress his Judaism. So now let's segue. What do we mean by Judaism after all? Because I think it's important to understanding the tension between Strauss and Oppenheimer. Most people, Jewish and Gentile, would instinctively say that Judaism is a religion. And yet, as we saw with Robbie, there are militant atheists who are Jews. So that's a little bit odd as far as fitting the definition of a religion. Judaism has also been described as a culture and as a nationality, and all those things have some value. Here's what I think is maybe the way I like to think about it, that the Jewish people are an extended family. And like a family, we don't always agree with each other. We sometimes, well, often, Jewish people often argue and criticize each other, hold each other to high standards. When a member of the family does something illegal, immoral, or shameful, we feel the shame. And I hope you can tell from my listing of all those Jewish scientists from the Manhattan Project that when a member of our family accomplishes something significant, we all feel proud. So it's actually interesting to look a little bit at Judaism in the United States because it evolved. So here are some critical dates in the history of Jews in America. I start with the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. Most of us know that 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but what probably only Jews are as aware of is that in 1492 Isabel and Ferdinand booted the Jews out of Spain in a very traumatic situation. Jews were told they either had to convert, they had to leave the country, or they had to submit to death. So the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492. They wandered for a while, many of them going to England and Holland. And 23 Jews settled in New Amsterdam in 1654. That's the first known Jewish community in the United States, or pre-United States, North America. The first synagogue was established in 1730. The first rabbi came to America in 1840. So if you didn't like to hear sermons, you had a good 110 years there where you didn't have to listen to a rabbi. I could not resist putting some of the anti-Semitic incidents in the history of Jews in this country up on the slides because I think it's part of this story. So you may not be aware of it, but U.S. Grant, when he was general, expelled all the Jews from his war zone. It was a very traumatic situation, but with rallying to President Lincoln, Lincoln overturned the order. Another bit of history that's going to be very important for us, Felix Adler, who I'll talk about momentarily, he publicly renounced Judaism. He was Jewish, but he publicly renounced it in favor of something he called ethical culture, and this is going to play an important role in the life of J. Robert Oppenheimer. I'm also listing a year later Joseph Seligman, who was an American banker and businessman, was refused admission to a hotel called the Grand Union Hotel in what I think is upstate New York, Sarasota Springs. Who was it who refused admission to Joseph Seligman? It was Henry Hilton. So this was, this is a little bit of anti-Semitism playing a role. Let me back up just momentarily, though, because you see the first rabbi coming to America in 1840. Why is that? It's because in the late 1700s, early 1800s, there was a movement in Germany that was led by a man named Moses Mendelssohn. He was the grandfather of the composer Felix Mendelssohn, by the way. But Moses Mendelssohn was sort of a reformer of Judaism. And he said that ideally Jews would no longer think of themselves as a separate race or nation, but rather as adherents of a religion. That was new. So until Moses Mendelssohn, nobody would have answered the question, what is Judaism, and said it's a religion. That concept did not exist before Moses Mendelssohn. And what he thought was the nationality of Jews in Germany would be German, unambiguously. And Jews would not be a bit less German for worshiping in a synagogue rather than a church. Unfortunately, that idea did not catch on in Germany. And it resulted in a fair amount of hostility towards Jews in Germany because it looked like they were trying to edge their way into German society. And so many Jews fled Germany. and many of them came to the United States because that seemed like a safer place to be, a place where Jews could express their Jewishness, if you will, in a more open way. And so it's important to realize that that's why the first rabbi came to North America, or to America, because now there were Jews there. And I'm going to show you a little bit about the population dynamics in a minute. But first, here's a cartoon from a magazine called Puck. And I don't know that you can see all the details, but this was a cartoon when Seligman was refused admission to the Grand Union Hotel. This cartoon shows in the middle of the screen, it's called Unobjectionable Gentile Clients. And who does that consist of? Corrupt politicians and convicted criminals, including Boss Tweed, who you may have heard of. Those are the people who are admitted to that Hilton hotel. The people who are not admitted include Seligman there, and you actually see Jesus in the middle there as well, not admitted. So Puck was trying to make a very strong statement. Let me continue the timeline with one more important slide here, because 1881 marked the beginning of huge pogroms. These are like government-sanctioned slaying and pillaging and all that, following the assassination of Alexander II in Russia. And that sparked a huge exodus of Jews. Most Jews who you come across in the United States are descendants of Jews who came from what's called the Pale of Settlement. That's where Jews were allowed to live in the Russian Empire in those days. And they came to the United States sometime after 1881. My grandparents all came after 1881 as a result of those pogroms. In fact, I will tell you, my grandmother witnessed the murder of her entire family except for her mother and a brother who had already come to the United States. So this is not like just distant history. I also mentioned the lynching of Leo Frank because I don't want to put all the blame on Russia. Leo Frank was lynched in Georgia following the commutation of his death sentence for a wrongful conviction of murder. He was accused of murdering somebody. His death sentence was commuted, and people decided, no, he needs the death sentence, and they lynched him. Why do I mention that in particular? Because you may know the musical Parade, which just won 2 Tonys, including Best Revisal on Broadway. That is all about the lynching of Leo Frank. I'm going to skip over some of these, but 1881 to 1924 was the window of opportunity for Jews to leave Russia during those pogroms. And then the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act put a halt to all of that. So that was it for Jews coming from Russia. I put a few more dates up there, and now I want to tell you a little bit about population. So here you see 1790, the American Jewish population is about 2,000 people. But it's not a smooth linear function. It's going to go up by 3 orders of magnitude, and you're going to see that it comes in bursts. So in 1840, the population was about 15,000. 1880, this is because of the Jews leaving Germany and coming to the United States where they thought they could be Jewish and fit in better. Now it's up to 250,000, and many of these German Jews ended up operating mercantile establishments. Certainly in Santa Fe, you can come across this very clearly, that the German Jews were the merchants around the plaza. If you look at all the places around the plaza, many of them were owned by German Jews. Then, another order of magnitude between 1880 and 1920, 2.5 million Jews coming from the pogrom experience in Russia, and they ended up largely settling in New York City. A lot of them ended up in the garment trade. Today, about 5.5 million Jews in the United States. That's less than 2% of the population of this country. Worldwide, 0.2% of the population of the world would be Jewish by some definition. And my family, of course, 37% of all American Nobel Prize winners were Jewish. So I said I was going to talk about Temple Emmanuel. So Temple Emmanuel plays an important role in our story. I haven't forgotten that we're talking about Oppenheimer and Strauss. So there's three images there. The smallest one is a picture of a loft building, and on the second floor of that loft building in 1845, 33 Jews started Temple Emmanuel on the Lower East Side in New York City. By 1868, many of the German Jewish immigrants had amassed some wealth, and the congregation built that magnificent Moorish building that you see, which was at Fifth Avenue and East 43rd Street. And that was a result of this German wave. But by 1927, the congregation had expanded. It merged with another synagogue, and Temple Emmanuel opened its new home, which is that big building that you see, and that is its current home. It opened that home at Fifth Avenue and 65th Street on the Upper East Side. At the time, Temple Emmanuel was the largest synagogue in the world. It has a sanctuary that seats more people than St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is only 10 blocks south. It was designed by Jewish architects, and it was intended to make a bold statement that having left persecution and fear behind, New York City's Jews had carved out its place in the mainstream of American life and reached the upper echelons. Well, not quite. That's from the website of Temple Emmanuel. That's what they want you to believe. But it wasn't so simple. I said we would talk about Felix Adler. This is an individual you may not know, but Felix Adler and his family came to the United States as part of that wave to support the German Jews who had come here. His father accepted an appointment as the rabbi at Temple Emmanuel. So you can kind of see how things are growing with the Jewish population in the United States. They bring over a German rabbi to lead the congregation, and Felix was only 6 years old when he came over, but he was already recognized as a brilliant individual, and the thought was he's going to follow in his father's footsteps. Let's make sure he gets trained. So he was sent back to Germany for his education. He got his PhD from Heidelberg. But he got exposed to a bunch of German ideas when he was there. And remember this business about whether Judaism is a religion or not a religion or whatever. So he was groomed to succeed his father. And I love this story. He was invited to give a talk. He was 23 years old. He came to Temple Emmanuel, where his father serves as the rabbi. He gave a talk. The talk was entitled, I have the title of his sermon here, The Judaism of the Future. And the congregation was shocked because he never mentioned God once. That's very important for our story, by the way. So Adler was never invited to come back to Temple Emmanuel again after that. And he missed his chance to become a rabbi, to become the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel. He actually went off on his own to found what's called the Society of Ethical Culture. And this is critical for the upbringing of Oppenheimer, because an offshoot of the Ethical Culture Society was the Ethical Culture School, and that's where Oppenheimer was educated. Now, why was that the choice for his education? His parents were very into the Ethical Culture Society because it didn't really talk about Judaism, right? Julius Oppenheimer, Robert's father, he was a trustee of the Ethical Culture Society, and Felix Adler conducted the wedding ceremony of Julius and Ella. So very important in their lives, and natural that they would send Oppenheimer to school there. Now, backing up just a minute, when Felix was in Germany, what did he get exposed to? This is important for the upbringing of Oppenheimer. He was enamored with Karl Marx. He was also strongly supporting solving the problem of the plight of the industrial working class. I suppose that filtered into his curriculum at the Ethical Culture School, and Oppenheimer undoubtedly imbibed some of that. I will mention that Adler was trying to develop what he called an answer to the problem, how to be a Jew if one did not believe any elements of the creed and how to be a good Jew and a good American at the same time. That problem has gone on for a long time, and that problem is actually still with us today, I think. So for this ethical culture society, it grew out of Judaism, but it was a non-religion. And I think that's very important for how Oppenheimer viewed himself, as a non-religious person, not as a non-religious Jew like Robbie, right? And Adler espoused a belief that was based on reason, not revelation, on scientific fact, not scripture. Sounds a little bit like the training you might want as a scientist. So what is Oppenheimer's connection to Judaism? I tried to put some high points on the slide here. You see that Oppenheimer, according to one of the things I read, earmarked 3% of his salary for 2 years in 1934 to help Jewish scientists emigrate from Germany. He also sponsored an aunt and cousin to emigrate from Nazi Germany, and he assisted them for years. But I think you have to dig pretty hard to find more evidence of his outward Jewish connection. At his clearance hearing, he said that starting in late 1936, he developed a smoldering fury about the treatment of Jews in Germany. I don't know how much of that is what he really was feeling in 1936. I don't know that we have any evidence of it. The clearance hearing, of course, was many years later. I will say that after Los Alamos, Oppenheimer was the most famous scientist probably in the world, and he should have had any job offer that, was out there. And yet Millikan at Caltech said, I think there are already enough Jews on the faculty, and tried to nip in the bud any luring of Oppenheimer back to Caltech. He got overruled, but it was too late. So what additional can I say here? Those are sort of the positives, right? This is now from a biography of Oppenheimer by Ray Monk. And that one's not as famous, I would say, as American Prometheus, but I think it's an excellent book. And what Monk says is, this is now a quote from Robbie, what prevented Oppenheimer from being fully integrated was his denial of a centrally important part of himself, his Jewishness. And now a quote from physicist Felix Bloch, a future Nobel Prize winner who worked on the Manhattan Project. He worked on the Manhattan Project for a little bit and then he left. But he said of Oppenheimer, and I love this quote, Oppenheimer tried to act as if he were not a Jew, and he succeeded well because he was such a good actor. That, I think, says a lot. Robbie is the one who says the most about Oppenheimer's Jewishness. Robbie says Robbie himself was proud of his Jewish inheritance and happy to define himself in terms of it, even though he was not a professing Jew. Not so for Oppie. Robbie said Jews would elicit a phrase, "These are my people," but Oppie would never call Jews his people. And then Robbie says, the sense in which Oppie was Jewish, the sense in which he did and did not come from and belong to a Jewish community, is far more complicated and crucial in understanding the fragility of his sense of identity. So I'm not saying this is the whole story to understand Oppenheimer, but I think it is a piece of it. Robbie does say Oppenheimer would have been a much better physicist if he had studied the Talmud rather than Sanskrit, and it would have given him a greater sense of himself. Robbie says that if Oppenheimer had mastered the literature of his own tradition, he would not have had the problems that come with denying one's own background. The Jewish tradition, and this is Robbie's words, even if you don't know it in detail, it's so strong that you renounce it at your own peril. It doesn't mean you have to be orthodox or even practice it, but if you turn your back on it, having been born into it, you're in trouble. And I think that's part of the trouble that Oppenheimer had. Robbie also says that Oppenheimer was overeducated in fields outside of science, and that prevented him from being the top-notch physicist that he was really capable of being. All right, I haven't forgotten Strauss. Let's do the same thing for him. He did a lot of things to express his Judaism. When he was fairly young, he volunteered to work for free for Herbert Hoover, who was given the task to lead the relief efforts for the European communities that had been decimated by World War I. And Strauss simply looked up what hotel Hoover was in, knocked on the door and said, "I'm here to work for free." And he helped with these European relief efforts. But at the same time, he was focused on the Jewish community, and he helped what was called the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which still exists today, called the Joint. It helps support Jewish communities in places where Jews are suffering. And Hoover himself was quite prejudiced against Jews, but nevertheless, Strauss, with this sort of aggressive personality, he repeatedly asked Hoover to intercede on behalf of Jews. There's a very powerful story about the death at the hands of the Poles of about 25 Jews, if I remember correctly. And Strauss was really livid about that, and he got Hoover to lodge formal complaints against the Poles. At the same time, Strauss got to see communism, and that plays a big role too, because he was quite anti-communist, and that was part of the tension between Oppenheimer and Strauss. So I mentioned Temple Emmanuel before. Felix Adler split off, formed the Ethical Culture Society, and Oppenheimer goes that route. Strauss, on the other hand, became the president of Temple Emmanuel for 10 years. And that's pretty important in his life, obviously. He put his money where his mouth was. He tried ransoming Jews from Germany with his own money. He thought of himself quite clearly as an American of Jewish religion. And one of the sources that I looked at was his autobiography called Men and Decisions. And virtually every chapter of that book starts with some Jewish quotation. So he's really out there recognizing his Judaism. Also, I saw that when he was chairman of the AEC, he started the first meeting that he served as chair. He started the meeting with a prayer. That is not Oppenheimer at Los Alamos. Those are quite different. So, you can find people who say that the real reasons why Strauss hated Oppenheimer were the political differences, conservative Republican versus liberal Democrat. Oppenheimer's mocking of Strauss in front of Congress, that played a big role. Allegedly, Oppenheimer's marital infidelities offended Strauss. You know about Oppenheimer's opposition to the hydrogen bomb development, and that played a role as well. But not to be forgotten is Oppenheimer's refusal to really identify as a Jew in America. And Strauss was threatened by that, if you will, because so Strauss was a political appointee, and he lived in Washington, D.C. for quite a while. And in an era when anti-Semitism was routine within the political and social establishment, Strauss successfully presented himself as a secular administrator with a special competence in science, but also a prominent Jewish layman. That's quite different from Oppenheimer. And but to be fair, this is a quote from Emilio Segre, another Nobel Prize winner who was at the lab during the war. "Strauss spoke with God, said Segre. I didn't like him." I think that sort of says it all. He wasn't a very easy person to get along with, apparently. Robbie said about Oppenheimer that Oppenheimer was unable to decide whether he wanted to be the president of the B'nai B'rith or the Knights of Columbus. And here you have Strauss, who was the president of Temple Emmanuel. So quite a different willingness to expose their Judaism. This is just a little bit of a summary about Oppenheimer. One thing I like about this picture, you see the pork pie hat, right? You can't miss Oppenheimer. The person who's got his hand at the crane, to the best of my knowledge, that is Louis Slotin, who died in a tragic accident, I think in 1946 after the war, when the screwdriver slipped and the critical mass came together. Louis Slotin was another Jewish scientist at the laboratory. He was Canadian and came to the lab, I think, as part of the British team. So I've said most of these things about Oppenheimer, except that the connection to Los Alamos or to New Mexico, as many of you know, started early on when Oppenheimer was 18. And Oppenheimer said physics and desert country were his two great loves. But why? Why? One of the appeals of the Southwest is, what did you not have out here? You didn't have the German Jewish community roaming the plains, right? So he got away from that. And it's quite clear when you read that when he was making his trip out to New Mexico, he tried to change his name. He tried to do some things to hide his Jewishness. I think most of the other things I would say about Oppenheimer you already know, but I did want you to listen to him, so let's hear that.
Robert Oppenheimer realized the grave responsibilities of our new knowledge.
Science has profoundly altered the conditions of man's life, both materially and in ways of the spirit as well. It has extended the range of questions in which man has a choice. It has extended man's freedom to make significant decisions. No one can predict what vast new continents of knowledge the future of science will discover. But we know that as long as men are free to ask what they will, free to say what they think, free to think what they must, science will never regress, and freedom itself will never be wholly lost.
I couldn't resist that. I mean, it's such a wonderful passage. That was from 1950. So before he lost his clearance, he was riding high. He was sort of the leading spokesperson for atomic science, certainly in this country. But you could hear some of that mysticism leaking into his speech, right? Not the kind of person that Strauss was. So let's turn to Strauss. A little bit older than Oppenheimer, about 8 years older, grew up in Virginia, as I said. He lost the vision in one of his eyes during a fight at the age of 10. That was that aggressive personality, I think. But he was no dummy. He was the valedictorian of his high school, and a quote from him says that more than anything else in the universe, the world of physics was the most exciting. That's quite interesting. I don't think people are aware of his real love of science. Strauss says in his autobiography that he got a copy of Millikan and Gale, and I happen to have a copy of that, which I probably had never opened before. This is a textbook for high school physics at the time that was written in the early part of the 1900s. And he cites in his autobiography this quote from Millikan, which I think is very prescient. "We can estimate the heat energy in the disintegration of 1 gram of radium. It is almost 2,000 million calories, fully 300,000 times as much as is evolved in the combustion of 1 gram of coal. Furthermore, it is not impossible that similar enormous quantities of energy are locked up in the atoms of all substances, existing there perhaps in the form of the kinetic energy of radiation of the electrons." Not everything's right here. "The most vitally interesting question which the physics of the future has to face is it possible for man to gain control of any such store of subatomic energy and to use it for his own ends?" That's in Millikan and Gale from the early part of the 20th century. I said that Strauss grew up with his family losing their wealth when he was a teen, and he went out selling shoes as a traveling salesman starting at the age, I think, of 16 or so. And sorry, I was going to use a Yiddish word, schlepping. Maybe everybody doesn't know that, but he was schlepping around these cases of shoes, taking, wagons and whatever conveyance he could get, trying to sell these shoes. But with that same stubborn personality, he refused to work on Saturdays. He needed the money, but Saturday was the Jewish Sabbath, and he didn't work on Saturdays even though it cost him some money. He eventually made a lot of money doing this, and that's when he went off and volunteered to work for Hoover for free. and he never went back. So even though he had earned enough money to go to college, he never went to college. And he moved up in the ranks. You see him pictured here with his wife Alice in 1925. Alice was the daughter of one of the partners in an investment company, an important largely Jewish-owned investment company in New York. And marrying one of the boss's daughters is not a bad route to success, and he was quite successful with that. Let's see. That's probably most of what I want to say. Well, I want to make sure you understand that he was quite successful up to a point, but his story is going to be tragic as well. So here's a little more information about Strauss. I love this picture. Why? Because you can see 5 individuals. 4 of them are sort of standing together, and one of them is off by himself. Well, it's Strauss who's off by himself there on the far right. No accident there. So who are the people in the picture? It's Robert Bacher on the far left, who I mentioned already as one of the ones who convinced Oppenheimer not to make this a military establishment. Next to Bacher is David Lilienthal, who was the first chair of the AEC. Also Jewish, by the way, and I will mention that there is an entry for Bacher in the Jewish Encyclopedia, but I can't substantiate anywhere that he was actually Jewish, so I have no idea why that entry is there. After Lilienthal is Sumner Pike, and then William Waymack, and Strauss is the last one there. In the first 2 years of the AEC, this is under Lilienthal's chairmanship, there were a dozen instances, most having to do with information security matters, in which Strauss was a 1 against 4 minority on the commission. So you could already see that he was gaining a reputation as being quite stubborn and quite focused on information security. Nevertheless, I want to share with you a quote that I saw in his autobiography. And this dates back to well before the Manhattan Project. But Strauss says, "Wiretapping has always been repugnant to me as a matter of principle." Now, I know that the lore is that he had Oppenheimer bugged and that was part of the mishandling, to say the least, of the security clearance hearings. But he does say that he thought that that invasion of privacy is inappropriate. I'll just mention that Strauss became a rear admiral, not for having actually seen combat, but he managed and rewarded fabrication plants who were engaged in munitions production. And it's because he was a successful investment banker and he understood what made companies work. Now, what's quite interesting about that is that he came up with the Army-Navy E Award. That was a way to reward companies, and you probably are familiar with that award coming to Los Alamos for its role in the Manhattan Project. That was his idea. So here we see him again, just finishing up his bio a bit. Strong proponent of developing the hydrogen bomb, urged the development of peaceful uses of atomic energy. He also fudged things a little bit. He minimized the health effects of radioactive fallout from thermonuclear tests. And of course, he was a driving force in revocation of Oppenheimer's security clearance. Here you see him sworn in as the acting Secretary of Commerce under Dwight Eisenhower. And the tragedy with Strauss is that there was a prolonged and vicious, nationally visible political battle in 1959, and Strauss was ultimately not confirmed by the Senate. That's very rare. So this was a big deal, and you know, the political dimensions were important here. Part of that was Strauss's behavior towards Oppenheimer, but I actually don't think that was the main reason that he didn't get confirmed. There's also a story associated with the Tennessee Valley Authority. Strauss, of course, was a real proponent of private business, being a conservative Republican and an investment banker, and there was a plan to build a reactor by a commercial private entity. And that was opposed by TVA because that would have been a threat to the Tennessee Valley Authority. And that led to an enormous amount of unhappiness on the part of the Senate, of the Democrats in the Senate. You may be familiar with a quote that says, too cheap to meter. That was attributed to Strauss. He's the one who came up with that. But it's unfair to say that he attributed that to nuclear fission. He actually was a strong proponent of nuclear fusion. And he was really talking about nuclear fusion when he said too cheap to meter in the future. And he helped arrange the Geneva Conference in 1958, the Geneva Fusion Conference. My thesis advisor, Ralph Lovberg, went to that conference and told me it was the most amazing conference they've ever had. This is when fusion became public knowledge, and there was a conference in 1958 in Geneva, Switzerland, and it was not like posters. People took their experiments and set them up, and when you went around the exhibition hall, you actually looked at working experiments, if you can believe that. But that was all Strauss's brainchild. I did want you to hear Strauss as well. This is not going to be the best audio clip. I will just tell you, this was after the Castle Bravo test in 1954, and this is when there was a lot of fallout, and Strauss is kind of minimizing that. But just listen for a little bit. So he goes on to talk about the wind failed to follow the predictions, blah, blah, blah. But you all probably know that was a serious problem for a lot of people, and he kind of downplays that. Of course, 1954, he's the chair of the AEC. That's why he's the one speaking on behalf of the president. You got to hear his southern twang there, too. We're going to listen to one more audio quote of him. This was from 1956. I think it's a little clearer. But before this, before 1956, and I think it was in 1954 also, after the Castle Bravo tests, Strauss came to Los Alamos. So this is now after Oppenheimer had been stripped of his clearance. There was a huge outcry among the scientists at Los Alamos, led by Fred Reby, and Strauss wanted to try to placate scientists. He didn't want them to be all angry at what had happened. And the story that I heard, first of all, this is called Operation Butter Up. So he was coming to turn on the charm in Los Alamos. And what Nick Lewis, who works out of the archives at the laboratory, told me is that Strauss met here at Los Alamos with a number of hostile scientists, and they walked out of the meeting totally charmed. And then they asked themselves, what just happened? You know, they had no idea, how did this guy do this? We came in here to be, you know, complaining about what happened to Oppenheimer, and he somehow fooled us into thinking everything's fine. Here's this audio clip. This was 1956, and this was the establishment of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Oh, I guess not. All right, no big deal. We're in the home stretch, by the way. Thank you for your patience. I just want to show some Time magazine covers. This is Strauss in 1953, and the caption says, U.S. atom boss Louis Strauss, the bomb race runs on Moscow time. So you know 1953. This is pretty challenging between the United States and Russia. I mentioned before that he lost one eye in a fight when he was 10 years old. I know this is a little glib, but to me, I think he had monovision. And I think it really was the way he viewed the world. He saw the world, you know, as very black and white. He lost both of his parents to cancer. And cancer treatment back then involved radioisotopes, and it was hard to get them. And he was very focused on what radioisotopes could do. that was the topic that led to his ridicule by Oppenheimer at those congressional hearings, by the way. So that's when he's flying pretty high. Here he is in 1959, and that's after he was not confirmed by the Senate, which was a huge tragedy for him. And it was somewhat of a comeuppance because of the Oppenheimer clearance revocation. Like I said, I'm not a politician. If you read his autobiography, it's not clear what was going on, but I think the TVA story is very important in this. By the way, he never mentions Clinton Anderson by name, the junior senator from New Mexico. He must say that phrase 100 times when he's talking about the confirmation, the junior senator from New Mexico, obviously not his ally. Not to be outdone, here's a Time magazine cover of Oppenheimer, and here the quote is, "What we don't understand, we explain to each other." I hope that's not actually what happens in the scientific world. But he's flying pretty high there in 1948, and here he is in 1954, and now the caption says, "Beyond loyalty, the harsh requirements of security." And so I'll share with you a quote from the book by Ray Monk. Oppenheimer cannot be understood without taking into account the importance of his deeply felt desire to overcome the sense of being an outsider that he inherited from his German Jewish background. This desire lies at the root of the ambivalence towards his Jewish ancestry that was noted by many of his closest friends, and at the root of what Einstein perceptibly described as Oppenheimer's unrequited love for the U.S. government. So there's that conflict. I'm going to close with just a few last words. How did I get to do this talk? So last year at the annual conference of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society, I had signed up to do a talk about the origin of the three parchment scrolls, what we call the Torah scrolls, that belong to the Los Alamos Jewish Center. I wanted to talk about their history. And I remembered some of the story by talking to Jay Wexler, whom many of you may have known, but I couldn't remember the details, and Jay passed away. So I started looking through the archives, such as they are, at the Los Alamos Jewish Center, and I came across this document, which you can't read, but I'm going to read the relevant passage to you, but I just have to find it first. Hang on. So this is from the, here, let's see. Oh, there we go. This is from the minutes of a board meeting in 1974. The minutes of a board meeting of the Los Alamos Jewish Center in 1974. And you may remember that Strauss died in 1974. And I came across this, and you may also know the name Roy Ryder. Roy Ryder was the head of the health division at the laboratory and a very important player in the Jewish community in Los Alamos. And it says in the board meeting minutes, Roy Ryder suggested that we should do something in memory of Admiral Strauss. In the early days, he did much personally for the Jewish Center and was especially useful in interceding for a loan. We should put a notice in the newsletter that goes out to the community. A motion was made and passed to buy some books for the library at the synagogue in his memory, and a letter should be sent to his family informing them. And I read that. This was in the course of looking for information about the Torah scrolls, and I thought, Louis Strauss, are you kidding me? That's who they're writing to? And then here is the letter that I found that they sent to his family. And it says the Los Alamos Jewish Center was deeply saddened to hear of the recent passing of Admiral Strauss. In appreciation for his early and enthusiastic support of our group, we are dedicating a series of books in the center library in his memory. We hope these books will serve as a fitting memorial to a great friend of our community, signed Dr. Maury Katz. So, I just was astounded when I read this, and that's why I wanted to put this talk together, to give a little bit of balance to this competition between Strauss and Oppenheimer. And my hope is that you at least see there's another dimension. This is the newsletter where they did what they said they would do and published an in memoriam there, telling the entire Jewish community that Admiral Strauss had done so much to help them. And then I'll just show you very briefly that in the course of looking through these archives, I came across this newsletter from 1980, where it says on March 21st, Friday night, services conducted by Jack Shlachter. I guess that was the first time I led a service at the Los Alamos Jewish Center. So if I was successful, perhaps Strauss's legacy has been a little bit improved here in Los Alamos. And you could say that the clash between the two individuals at least had a Jewish dimension to it. And it might be expressed perhaps as a clash between ethical humanism, that's the Adler ethical cultural school, and ethical monotheism, which is kind of what Strauss represented. And I've pushed them a little bit closer here in my attempt to show that maybe it's not quite as bad as it seemed. So I want to thank you for your attention. I put a picture up here just to be provocative, and thank you for your attention. And here's some references and acknowledgments. Thanks very much.
So again, our apologies for starting a little late, but I think your talk provoked at least a few questions.
Where was the emergency exit again?
So maybe we'll take 2-3 questions, and if you could be brief in stating your question, and then we'll have Jack's response. So.
Well, I have a question. You might have said this, and I just didn't hear it, but would you say that Robert Oppenheimer was an atheist? Did he believe in God?
The question had to do with whether Oppenheimer was an atheist. I don't remember. I mean, he had that mystical view of the universe, right? There must have been something greater than our human existence, but I don't know much more than that. Sorry, that's an excellent question. You could ask me about my belief too, and it would be probably equally fuzzy.
One of your bullets about Oppenheimer indicated that he tried to get Jewish scientists out of Germany in 1934.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so is that because they were scientists? Because they were Jews? Or
I think probably both. That's a good question. And look, when I put that slide together, my goal was to find positive Jewish connections for Oppenheimer, and I had to work hard to find them. So that was one thing that I found. I think the fact that they were scientists was clearly important, but certainly they were Jewish because those were the people who were in trouble under the Nazis after 1933. I put my other glasses on so I can see who's about to grill me here, Steve.
Well, I just wanted, didn't Strauss also try to remove Oppenheimer from the Institute of Advanced Studies?
Not that I remember. I think that the committee had Oppenheimer ranked number 1. They actually had Strauss ranked number 5 to be the director, is my recollection.
No,
And
after that, I think there was a vote after the clearance revoking.
I don't remember that. That could be the case, but I don't remember.
Yeah, I believe the board voted against Strauss in that case.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. Thanks for informing me. I can hand you the microphone. That's an easy way
I
to do it.
just wondered if you could speak a little bit about the relationship between Edward Teller and...
Yeah, I couldn't think of anything more provocative to put as my last slide. The truth is, maybe because I'm aging, I've sort of seen nuance even with Edward Teller. You know, I mean, he's such, if, here we have a street in Los Alamos that's Oppenheimer. If there was a back alley, it would be Teller, right? But he had his good points too. I think what it is these people were passionate and they wouldn't let lying stand in their way to get what they wanted. And I think Teller fits that description. That's my understanding. I think he was he had a strong reason to be anti-communist. You have to understand these people's childhoods and the environment they grew up in. You know, he saw what happened in Hungary. And I think you just have to take that into account and not be quite so harsh when, I'm not trying to lecture you. I need to realize that I need to be not so quick to jump to a conclusion.
Hello. Thank you so much for your lecture. I thought it was really, really good. I have one of those personal stories about Oppenheimer and Strauss, and that is that my father, who many of people here probably knew, was Robert Thorne, and my mother came from a family of fairly wealthy New York City Jewish people. And my great-grandfather on my mother's side was friends with Louis Strauss. So when my father got his PhD, and he had several job offers, and he wasn't really sure exactly where he wanted to go. So he'd been here in '49 as a graduate student, and so Strauss provided a letter of introduction to Robert Oppenheimer. So when my parents were in California, they went through Oregon and California, and my father was already familiar somewhat with Los Alamos because of the summer he spent here. So they had lunch with Robert Oppenheimer and Kitty Lou. And I don't remember really anything that my father specifically said about that, except for that Robert Oppenheimer recommended that he come to Los Alamos because of the interesting people he would interact with here. And the answer to almost any science question that you might have, you could probably talk to one of the world's experts about that problem. And my mother's comment about the whole thing was that Robert Oppenheimer he rarely sat down at the table for lunch. He was pacing around, he wasn't interested in the food, and he was smoking constantly. So that, I consider that to be, I don't know exactly what year that was, that they had lunch together and that he got that letter of introduction. But my great-grandfather and Louis Strauss apparently had a pretty close relationship because my great-grandfather on my mother's father's and, all four of her grandparents were deeply involved in the Jewish community of New York City.
Thanks. I think in that anecdote, there's a little clue about Oppenheimer again. What Jewish person paces around and skips the lunch? I mean, that just doesn't sound right to me. I'm happy to stick around, actually, because I know you've all been very patient, and I don't want to test you too much. So I'm happy to stick around and answer questions offline, too.
But let's take a moment to thank again